The Washington Post is reporting tonight in another blockbuster breaking news story that it was the President of the United States who dictated the exact wording of Donald Trump Jr.'s first statement to the New York Times on July 8th about his meeting during the campaign with a Russian lawyer with ties to the Kremlin, along with several other people in the room that day, which included other Russians and the president's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner, who did not disclose that meeting as he was required to do on his application for a security clearance. It is news that the president dictated every word of that statement, but it is not news that that statement was a lie. The statement of Donald Trump Jr., as dictated by the president from Air Force One, said, "It was a short introductory meeting. I asked Jared and Paul to stop by. We primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children that was active and popular with American families years ago and was since ended by the Russian government. But it was not a campaign issue at the time, and there was no follow-up. I was asked to attend the meeting by an acquaintance, but was not told the name of the person I would be meeting with beforehand." Tonight's Washington Post reporting shows that the White House knew that that statement, as dictated by the president, was a lie. And we know this because on the very first day of General John Kelly's service as White House Chief of Staff, the White House is leaking like crazy, which is to say, leaking like yesterday and the day before and every other day of the leakiest president in history. Donald Trump fired Reince Priebus as the White House Chief of Staff on Friday and replaced him with General Kelly specifically to stop this, to stop what happened tonight, to stop the leaks to the Washington Post and to the New York Times that come blasting at us virtually every night. The sources cited in the Washington Post article are all unnamed advisors to the president. And the Washington Post has multiple sources when describing how the most inexperienced communication staff in White House history, Hope Hicks and Josh Raphael, quote, advocated for a more transparent approach. The Washington Post quotes people with knowledge of the conversations. This is a day one disaster for the new White House Chief of Staff, whose job it is to plug those leaks. That's job one. That's what the president wants from him the most. And it is another disastrous story for the White House, showing the president trying to cover up the truth of what happened in his son and son-in-law's meeting with the Russians at Trump Tower during the presidential campaign. An unnamed presidential advisor in the Washington Post story said, quote, now someone can claim he's the one who attempted to mislead. Someone can argue the president is saying he doesn't want you to say the whole truth. The Washington Post article then says, although misleading the public or the news media is not a crime, advisors to Trump and his family told the Washington Post that they fear any indication that Trump was seeking to hide information about contacts between his campaign and Russians almost inevitably would draw additional scrutiny from Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. In an example of the public communications message that the new White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, seems to be controlling tonight, the White House is referring all questions about the Washington Post article to the outside lawyers who are defending the president and his son-in-law in the special prosecutor's investigation. We can only wonder how the White House communications team would have responded if Anthony Scaramucci was still in charge of White House communications, even though he had never actually been hired by the White House. He was the only White House communications director who was in charge of all the communications without having been hired. Friday night on this program, I said that the incoming White House Chief of Staff would face a very clear challenge on Monday, today. I think we have a test for General Kelly on day one, and that is exactly how many minutes does it take him to yank those White House credentials off the neck of Anthony Scaramucci, because if Scaramucci works in that White House, by definition, General Kelly has failed to control that White House. And he passed. General Kelly passed that test today. It was the easiest test that any White House chief of staff has ever been given. And now he has the Jared test, the Ivanka test. The job of White House chief of staff was called appointments secretary until Richard Nixon militarized the title to chief of staff. The power of the appointments secretary was the power of who got to see the president. The appointments secretary was supposed to be an honest broker who made sure that the president was hearing all of the relevant information needed for presidential decision-making and none of the nonsense that interferes with presidential decision-making. Jared Kushner is one of the horrifically incompetent people in the White House who advised the president to fire FBI Director James Comey. It is General Kelly's new job to prevent advice like that making its way to the president. Advice from a person with no authority or expertise who has nothing helpful to say. There is a roving band of such people in the White House now with access to the president: Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, to name but the most prominent. The list goes on to include most other people working in the White House. No other White House chief of staff has ever had the job of keeping most people who work in the White House away from the president. No other White House chief of staff has ever had the job of deciding whether to revoke the president's son-in-law's security clearance, which the son-in-law lied to obtain. That's John Kelly's job now. John Kelly is now the commander of a ship of fools. The challenge that he faces now is unlike any challenge he has ever faced. Tomorrow's challenge, and the challenge for the day after that, and the day after that, will be, which fool did he control or get rid of that day?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.